We got a little further along, and so now all we have is the 20th century and a little bit of the 21st, but it gives us a great opportunity to think about what the 21st century is about, because that story hasn't been written yet. The story of the 20th century is caught up in really, as I've kind of identified it, in these four themes of Zionism, anti-Semitism, immigration, and division. And those are the four themes as they affect the Jewish world. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about each of them. And then what we're going to see is there's a kind of a transition as we look to the larger issues of the world. We focus really on Zionism and anti-Semitism. And then as we look to the development of the Jewish world in the United States, we look to the issues of immigration and division. So there's this concept, and I just want to put it back in the back of your head, of Jewish unity. Is there such a thing as Jewish unity? And as we've passed through history, going even back to the time of the first historicity, the kings, there's a lot of people who believe that Jewish unity is possible. But if you look over the course of human history, since the kings, the period of Jewish unity amounted to the period of time in which Solomon reigned as king. And before Solomon and after Solomon, you could really create the question as whether or not there was ever any true Jewish unity. Because after Solomon, there's a divided kingdom, and there's the north and the south, and then people come and people disappear, and we're scattered and diverse, and we never really come back together, and there's this dichotomy between the Talmudists and the Karaites, and then the transition from into the Middle Ages, with as the Jewish community spread out between Muslim lands and Christian lands, and there was never any real unity. And then we even come into the 20th century, and there are a lot of historians who would say the only time there was Jewish unity was in the days following the Six-Day War in 1967, when there was a feeling of great pride over the survivability of Israel, and the day after Yom Kippur in 1973, when the Yom Kippur broke out, Yom Kippur War. And all Jewish congregations came together, and people crossing boundaries and lines all, kind of came out in support. So, one might have there's this real big question about Jewish unity. So I just want to keep that in the back of our heads. So let's talk first about Zionism and what it represented for Judaism in the 20th century. So Zionism begins in 1897 with really the first Zionist Congress. It actually begins before that. But its formal beginning, it's framed by this congress of Jewish leaders from all over Europe who had gathered together to come to talk about the idea of the establishment of a state of Israel. And it really began as a movement predominantly made up of secular Zionists, people who were politically focused on the establishment of Jewish hegemony in a place. And the reason why I say it was secularly focused is because that place wasn't Israel. So as we know that there were other choices. There was the Madagascar, and there was Uganda, and there was New York, and there was Palestine, which was almost an afterthought to the First Zionist Congress. Bialik, the great Hebrew poet, wrote that he would be happiest when the first Jewish prostitute is arrested by a Jewish policeman in a Jewish city in Israel and thrown into a Jewish prison. That's how he defined true Zionism. Unfortunately, that's happened. So maybe Bialik is happy. I don't know. The important piece is that there was no unanimity then, and even within Zionism. Because as soon as the secularists created this kind of focus on establishing a country, the religious Zionists emerged and said, well, if you're going to do it, it has to be Palestine. It has to be Israel. But at first, there was opposition to Zionism, as we know. There were the assimilationists, especially from the United States, who were opposed to establishing a Jewish country. From Western Europe as well, because they were afraid of the question of allegiance. Where is your allegiance? If there is a Jewish state and there is a conflict, where would your allegiance rest? And there are those like Stephen Wise here in the United States, who were very American, and many of the early Reform rabbis of the 20th century were staunchly American, so that there was no room for them to support the establishment of the State of Israel. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I grew up in Houston, and there were two Reform congregations. The one I grew up at was the Breakaway in 1944 from the other Reform congregation over the issue of Zionism. That the other Reform congregation, Beth Israel, came out strongly anti-Zionist, took a very big stance. The rabbi that was the rabbi at the time, Hyman Judah Schachtel, became the spokesperson in the South for the American Council for Judaism. The American Council for Judaism was the name of the anti-Zionist organization created by Jews because they were American and did not want to give the impression that their allegiances were questionable. So there was a split, a schism in Houston over the issue of Zionism, and a couple of hundred families left Beth Israel and formed Emmanuel. And I can be proud that my grandfather, who had never been to Israel, was one of the founders of Emmanuel. My other grandparents were founders of Beth Israel. so it's just really...
Did they get along?
They lived in very different worlds. So my father's family was like, the driving Miss Daisy of the South families. And they were very ensconced in Houston, in the secular Houston. My mother's family was very also embedded in the culture of Texas, but more in tune with the larger Jewish gestalt, if you will.
Was that true in other communities across the United States?
Yeah, there were other communities like that, where you had strong anti-Zionist congregations and communities, and then you had strong pro-Zionist communities.
We visited a very old and large Jewish synagogue in Richmond, founded by returning Jewish officers from the Confederacy. And they didn't even use Jewish, it was the Hebrew graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
They used the term Hebrew.
Well, if you look at in some of the larger cities, so Indianapolis has Indianapolis Hebrew congregation, Washington has Washington Hebrew congregation, Baltimore has Baltimore Hebrew congregation. So some of the strong anti-Zionist communities use that term to and we moved away from Hebrew names of congregations, like the Temple was the main congregation in Atlanta, the Temple. Even though it has a Hebrew name, nobody ever knew it. It was never on any literature. It was just called the Temple. And then, so there were the assimilationists, and then on the other side there was the religious voice of Messianism, that you can't establish the state of Israel without the Messiah. And so the strong Orthodox religious voice was opposed to the Zionist Congress because they felt that it was a slap in the face of 2,000 years of Jewish longing for the reestablishment of the state of Israel. Religious Zionists changed their view when it became apparent that the secular Zionists were leading the conversation. And so they were left with a choice of sacrificing some value, which was, you can't have Israel because there's no Messiah, versus we can't be in the conversation because we're anti-Zionists. And they became Zionists to a point so that they could be a part of the conversation. And that's when the conversation changed by the Sixth Zionist Congress, which was 1903. Religious Jews became focused on Israel. That Israel had to be that place. Palestine. During this Zionist the unfolding of the Zionist conversation, there was an elevation of anti-Semitism, especially in the early 1900s. In 1903, there was a pogrom in Kishinev that decimated the Jews of Kishinev. I think 60,000 Jews were killed. And in 1 year in that pogrom. 2 years later, 1905, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were published, which is for those who don't know, it's a major anti-Semitic tractate written as if it were written by Jews, but about how we, in essence, owned the world.
That's amazing staying power.
Right.
I have an associate, someone I work with, who freely accepted it. He said, well, it was creepy. Frankly.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a prejudiced person. He just accepted it as a fact. That's the way we Jews are.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't Henry Ford distribute it?
Right. So Henry Ford distributed it.
He used Ford automobiles, dealerships.
Right. Hitler cleaved to it, and it's never going away. And it continues, especially through in Eastern Europe. It holds a lot more power than it has in Western society. Hopefully because there's a little bit more education in the West than there is in the East. But it has continued to be a thorn in the side of the Jewish world. And in 1911, there was a blood libel. Now this blood libel, and I'll read a little bit about it.
Rabbi,
Yes.
would you like to discuss at this time what the factors causing Zionism, or is that inappropriate?
Well, we can talk about it. Let me just get this. So, in March of 1911, the body of a young boy was found in Kiev, and Menachem Mendel Bayless, who was the local superintendent of a brick kiln, was accused of murdering the child for the sake of using his blood for Nazi. Bayless was jailed, found innocent, but the damage was done to the Jewish community. In 1913, remember, was the Leo Frank trial here in the U.S. And so these are all contemporarily happening, even across the seas. Even though, the governor finally commuted the sentence, Frank was hung by a mob in 1915. So let's talk a little bit about Zionism. So why 1897? Why does it come to the forefront at the end of the 19th century and become the kind of the rallying cry into the 20th?
Was it originally from the Dreyfus case? Was that where Herzl concluded that there could be no justice for Jews unless they were in their own homeland?
Okay. Bruce?
Another possibility is the so-called Jewish problem, that Jews had no place in society, and there was no future for them in society. So what was the alternative? There were two alternatives. Assimilation, becoming a Christian, or getting the heck out and having your own country.
Mhm.
So the Jewish problem.
Okay.
Well, that's so-called.
All right. So, I think there's definitely truth in both of those statements. Zionism became a rallying cry for a Jewish world that was, on some level, dissolving. So when Napoleon, in the end of the 18th century, emancipated the Jews began to move out of the ghetto, began to live amongst people different than themselves. Judaism began to, lost its rigidity and began to dissipate, diffuse into society. 100 years later, Judaism had drifted. Reformed Judaism had been born. Jews had moved wholeheartedly to the U.S., especially at the 1880s, the first waves of immigration, the first Aliyah, movement out of Europe into the land of liberty. And I think many Jewish historians recognize that Judaism, in order to survive, needed a rallying cry beyond religion, something beyond the Torah portion of the week. And, clearly, Herzl's experience with the Dreyfus Affair and the Jewish world's experience with this drift gave a lot of credibility to the establishment of an idea, and that idea was embedded in homeland. So when we move past the teens in time, or as we move into the teens, we have war. War is another unifying factor. In World War I, we have all these empires. And so the 20th century is also marked by the rise and fall of these empires. Our history professor at Hebrew Union College, Ellis Rivkin, said that really there were only two empires, the British and the U.S., and all these others were toys. And he was convinced that the world was being run by the British. And that's why anti-Semitism flourished, because he was convinced that the British were the biggest anti-Semites of any country throughout history. We'll talk a little bit about that. But he lived in his own reality. He actually printed a political journal called The Globalist. And in his journal, that's the attitude, that it was that really the balance of power had nothing to do with Russia. It had everything to do between the British and the U.S.
We're talking about the teens now?
We're talking about the 20th century, the whole, yes, the whole 20th century. So really, the challenge here in the 20th century is a challenge of empires. In World War I, you had Germany and the Ottomans, okay, against Russia and the U.S. and the British. And as we know, in World War I, that we win. And so two of the powers where Jews are a heavy part of the population, the Axis powers, Germany and the Ottoman Empire, are suddenly, Jews are suddenly free in a way, but they're also challenged in a way because within that country, that loss has a heavy price. And so
your contention is that the Jews that there were a restriction of Jews under the Ottomans and in Germany that were released after World War I?
that we became an easy, embedded scapegoat.
Yeah.
So, clearly Germany, as it emerged from World War I into the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism was predicated on an embedded evil within Germany, and that was the Jews. And then when you look at early Nazi propaganda, it's not that our problems are being caused by the United States, because our market tanked and destroyed the world economy. It's our problems are caused by the Jews. In many ways, who, own the banks and own the businesses and own the financial institutions, and they drove our economy into the ground.
But prior to World War I, how were the Jews treated within the Ottoman Empire and the German?
Well, that's a good question. So in the Ottoman Empire, for certain, prior to the rise of Zionism, all right? So we have to go back into the 19th century. Because if you go back into the 19th century, Jews in the Ottoman Empire were fairly satisfied. There was a kind of a great calm by Jews living in Muslim lands who weren't equal citizens, but we weren't in fear. As soon as the rise of Zionism begins in 1897, Jews in Ottoman lands lived in fear because the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire said, these Jews are going to infect our Jews, and therefore isolation, laws that prevent Jews from self-determination. All of this began at the beginning of the 20th century. So the period right prior to World War I was not a great period for Jews in the Ottoman Empire. Just as Jews in Germany lived fairly well prior to, during, and immediately following World War I. Jews were government and military and, society, and there was no distinction really between religion and, there were always shreds through Europe of anti-Semitism, but nothing like what happened after World War I. So, as World War I unfolded, as we know, the reparations for World War I was that the Ottoman Empire was decimated, and it was carved up. And the British were given control of most of the Ottoman Empire. Not all of it, most of it. French got some of it, and so the British then become the controlling force for the Jews who are living in the Ottoman Empire. What does that mean? This is where Rivkin kind of gets his fodder, and he's convinced that the British were greater anti-Semites than all the Muslims in the world combined. Because he believes the British had their eyes on Arab oil and not on human rights. And that if the British wanted to advance their society, rebuild their world from World War I, and move on into the 20th century, they needed oil. And they needed that which the Arab countries of the Ottoman Empire had. And so they were willing to sacrifice the Jews for the sake of Arab oil.
But to me, that doesn't make them anti-Semitic because they didn't really care. They were really neutral. It's not like they had feelings about it. They wanted oil and they were just playing pawns. It's not,
Okay. That's fine. I'm not trying to defend Rivkin. I'm just telling you how where that attitude comes from. I'm not so sure, that he's correct, but there's a lot of merit to the idea that much of what happens in the early part of the 20th century, period between World War I and World War II, is orchestrated by the British and those who get the short stick are the Jews.
Now, on the Arab side, they have the oil as, a predominant reason for British appeasement. Now, Chaim Weizmann was a chemist, who was a British chemist. So the Jews also had some reasons to be appeased by the British.
You're building factories, you're running trains, yes, there were scientists, but not enough. I don't believe that amounted to nearly the same importance that oil in the early part of the 20th century.
And what role did Churchill play? The reason I'm asking, he was Vice Admiral of the Navy, and he was very much a proponent of oil because that made the ships go faster than coal could.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't he also pretty anti-Semitic?
No.
Say it again, Mike?
Churchill, in his early years?
I don't know.
Okay. I heard an interesting comment by an Israeli who's involved in studies and all this thing. He summed it up by saying, somebody asked a question about aren't we friends with Israel? And he brought it down to countries don't have friends, countries have interests.
That sounds very British, doesn't it?
Okay. So a few dates that are really important So World War I ends. 1917 is when Lord Balfour signs the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration says, in essence, there should be a state of Israel in the land called Palestine. That's all it says. Doesn't specify dimensions or lines or anything. It just says there should be one. 1922 establishes the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. Not a fan of Israel. And then 1922 is also the first of many British white papers. What are white papers? They're kind of policy that isn't policy. Statements of interest. So 1922, the British white paper then says, we need to curtail a little bit of the immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. Why do we need to curtail it? Because the Arabs who are in Palestine are concerned that too many Jews are moving there. And therefore say to the British, if you don't curtail immigration, we're going to cut back on our oil that we're selling to you. Somewhere in the period between 1922 and 1929, a guy named Menachem Begin organized what was called the Irgun. The Irgun was the first iteration of an Israeli army. They were guerrilla fighters in their purest sense. They fought with whatever they could find, steal, or manufacture themselves. And tensions began to mount within the former Ottoman Empire, within Palestine, between Jews and Arabs. They came to a head in 1929 with a riot in Hebron where 67 Jews were killed. Now we think about it, 67 Jews, is that notable? Given the rest of our 20th century experience, it was very notable then. And if you look at, papers and, I have the New York Times for all these years, and you kind of see on the front page what makes the news. And in 1929, this riot in Hebron made the news of the New York Times. In the midst of the crash of the stock market and all of the disastrous, economic issues that happened because of the Depression, that made the news is illustrative. Shows where people's heads were. The period of time between 1930 to the beginnings of World War II is a very short amount of time. So Hitler's rise to power is 1933. So there's not a lot of distance. There's a blossoming anti-Zionism, anti-Judaism fervor in the world that Hitler seizes on in 1933. It is his calling card. It's why he wins the election. Because he has a scapegoat. And Germany's economy is emaciated emasculated because of the reparations they were paying from World War I. And they were clearly seeking a reason. And when he offered one, Germans bid. Hook, line, and sinker. I don't want to talk so much about the Holocaust right now, but we have this blossoming of anti-Judaism. What's going on here, United States? So in 1924, according to the statistics I found, there were 3 million Jews in the United States. 5 years later, there were 4 million Jews. There's a huge movement west. In these years of the early period following World War I. What happens? So the gates are reasonably open. Ellis Island becomes the focus. New York is the locus of much of this growth, at least the East Coast corridor, from Washington to Boston. But most of it's centered around New York. The rise of tenements. You have the sweatshops. 1911 is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
What year was that?
1911.
Now, where did the immigrants mostly come from in this period? The Jewish immigrants?
So originally, so Jewish immigration from 1880 to probably 1900 was predominantly Eastern Europe. Eastern European immigration. We begin to see after the turn of the century that shifting further west. Most of the people coming to the U.S. were coming to the U.S. to leave the pogroms behind them. They were fleeing war. They were fleeing anti-Jewish feelings in the countryside. Many of them came to flee Judaism. They were not religious Jews, they were assimilationists. They were trying to find a new world, a new way of life, a new path, and that which had, kind of guided them was no longer. What they found was they came to this country and the U.S. working environment wasn't friendly to them. Many of them were faced with signs in their workplaces that said, if you don't come to work on Saturday, don't come to work on Monday. And so the idea of assimilation was embedded in them. And so many Jews did just that. They gave up Shabbat for the sake of a job. And what's interesting is the rabbinic responsa of the time permitted it. It says in the rabbinic responsa that if you are forced to work on Shabbat, or by not working on Shabbat, become a ward of the state. You must work on Shabbat. And so there was this push to leave those kind of core Jewish values behind. This is where division enters. So you have people who come from religious backgrounds in the shtetls of Eastern Europe. They land on the ship at Ellis Island, and suddenly they're thrust into a tenement in in New York, and they have to scrap for food and jobs and work, and they are putting their Jewish, not all, but many are putting their Judaism aside, separating from it, because they need to in order to survive with their family.
Actually, the wage records from the 1880s until 1912 show that the wages in New York City were in a steady decline. As more people came in, the wages continuously fell. Which is, of course, one of the things that gave impetus to the unions later on. And also, one reason why so much immigration was allowed into this country in that time frame, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, push wages down.
Right. So this is all about. We took a population, and we're going to pull that population apart. Even our institutions did that. So and I'm just going to run through some dates. 1873, the Reform Movement is created in Cincinnati by Isaac Mayer Wise. 1875, the Reform Movement creates a school for higher Jewish learning in Cincinnati. 1889, the Reform Movement ordains its first class of rabbis and causes a division between it that gives rise to the conservative movement. How? 1889, the first 4 rabbis who had been trained in this country were ordained. The women's organization at Wise Temple in Cincinnati wanted to provide a celebratory kiddush lunch for those 4 rabbis, but for all the dignitaries that had come from all over the world to be a part of this ordination. This was a major event. The women, of course, created what became known later as the Treif Banquet. They served all kinds of treif foods because they were assimilationists, and they wanted to give food that would be seen as the best for everybody. And the assimilationists created the Treif Banquet, and I think 10 faculty members from Hebrew Union College resigned on the spot. And then the following week were teaching in New York at Jewish Theological Seminary, which was the new school, a couple of years old now, for conservative rabbis to be trained. Now, the conservative movement doesn't begin for another 15 years, 20 years. But the impetus was there. So Reform Judaism created conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism created then Reconstructionist Judaism. How? Because Mordecai Kaplan wanted his daughter to read from Torah in 1927 at the conservative movement's seminary. They said no. He left. He left teaching and moved to Philadelphia, where his followers then established the Reconstructionist movement. Another division.
What was the incident that happened to
He wanted his daughter to have a bat mitzvah. 1927, it was unheard of. And he wanted his daughter to be able to read from the Torah in the chapel at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York.
And the Reform wasn't doing that either at that time?
No.
Rabbi, what's the relationship of this in the U.S. with the Reform founding in Germany? Was there any coordination, any transplant, any?
So the establishment of the Reform movement in Europe and Germany was the catalyst for Reform Judaism coming to the United States. But by the time it came to the United States, and by this time especially, Reform Judaism in the United States had morphed into an anti-orthodoxy. Reform Judaism in Europe did not morph into an anti-orthodoxy. In many ways, it maintained a whole lot of trappings of that orthodoxy. And if you go to a Reform congregation in Europe today, it would appear much more orthodox than what we would do here. And that's because of the cultural milieu in which it exists. Orthodoxy had its own division. In 1896, the Rabbi Elchanan something theological seminary was established. Rabbi Elchanan, I think it was Elchanan Isaac, maybe, theological seminary, which became the precursor to Yeshiva University. And what that did within Orthodoxy is it created its own schism, because there was traditional Orthodox yeshivot in Europe, but it wanted to have an Orthodox yeshiva in the United States, to train rabbis for the United States. And that yeshiva became a liberal Orthodox yeshiva, which then ultimately gave rise to a modern Orthodox university that taught both Judaism and secular subjects. Yeshiva University was established in 1915. And so the divisions within Judaism began to pull people again into pockets of community.
But this wasn't the first time. If we go back in our classes, this has been the story, for almost from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We are a diverse people. There has not been, throughout the human encounter, great periods of Jewish unity. There have been moments, but not centuries of moments. And so we are, when you look at all of these happening and all the concurrence and conflation of time, that all of this is kind of happening contemporaneously with Zionism, with anti-Semitism, with immigration, with people moving from east to west, west to east, north to south, that what we have here is an opportunity to really embrace diversity. That's what I think the story of the 20th century is about. We want to see it as Jewish unity, but it is really a function of Jewish diversity. The latter half of the 20th century is about destruction and rebirth. Destruction and rebirth. And the latter half of the 20th century has been a challenge to Judaism. We've seen the flourishing of Jewish institutional life, and the 21st century has brought the demise of its institutional life. We've seen the rebirth of Jewish learning, which has been a very positive kind of sense of the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century. But the 21st century is about the relevance of Jewish learning. So the latter half of the 20th century, we taught kind of a Holocaust mentality to people. We have to be Jewish because, never again will we allow this happen. The 21st century, that message isn't working for students, for the 20-somethings in the world. Now the message is relevance. Why is Judaism relevant? What is the relevance of a Jewish life? People are no longer supporting institutions because it's the responsible thing to do. They want to know why it's relevant to support an institution. Why is it important? What benefit does the institution merit?
Well, what am I getting out of it?
Sure. The 20th century was about the rediscovery of who we are as a people. And the 21st century is about the discovery of who I am in the midst of a people. It's more centric, more self-centered than corporate-centered. The 20th century is about the growth of the latter half of the 20th century is about expanding the Jewish community, the 21st century is about maintaining a shrinking Jewish community. We watched in the 20th century the number grow of Jews in the United States to somewhere close to 8 million. And now if you look at all the Federation demographics and population studies, we're saying there's about 5.2 million Jews in the United States. Where did 3 million Jews go?
When we're counting that, what counts as a Jew? In other words, is it self-declaration?
Right, so the last population study is just that. Do you consider yourself Jewish? 5.2 million Jews. And so, that's the transition point between the 20th and the 21st. Of watching that number slide downward, which creates a bit of a pause. We watched in the Reform movement. The 20th century, we grew to almost 950 Reform congregations in the United States. In the 21st century, we're down under 850 congregations. Down nearly 100 congregations. What happens to those people? What happens to those bricks and mortar buildings? They become Baptist churches, community centers. So it's not that I don't want to leave this on a kind of a note of depression, but as a rabbi, it's like, wow. I've been a rabbi for nearly 30 years now, and I'm just watching this kind of ebb and flow, and now it's kind of, drifting south a little bit, and what does the future hold for Judaism in the 21st century? The 21st century has given rise to a curious thing. The synagogue without walls. Synagogues that no longer have buildings. That meet not like a chavurah in someone's home, but they rent some place for what they need. We need a place on Friday night, we'll rent a place for 3 hours. We don't need that place from, Saturday to Thursday night. We only need it for 3 hours on Friday night. So the synagogue without walls has become the kind of the new model. We have this woman running around the hills of Colorado, the adventure rabbi.
She was a guest here. Yes.
Her synagogue is Aspen Mountain, It's like,
Yes. We read her books. She was here. Yes.
Right. So that's what the 21st century brings. The 21st century brings an organization out of Los Angeles called IKAR, I-K-A-R. It's a synagogue without walls. It's the largest synagogue in the LA area. They claim over, I think, 3,000 members. They don't have a building. They move from place to place.
Well, isn't there another context we might be aware of, and that has to do with the general decline in religion in the United States? Is that not the case?
That's true. That's for everyone.
Is it not the case that Christian congregations are shrinking as well?
Exactly.
Yes.
Of course. Institutional religion is on the decline. I won't say religion is on the decline. Institutional religion is on the decline. So the 20th century was all about building bricks and mortar institutions. The 21st century is something else.
Now, when they did the self-declaration of Jewish, did they also have category of part Jewish? Do they treat it as an ethnic background as well as religious background?
I really don't.
I don't remember that survey. The Confederations did major census studies. And they didn't even ask people if they're a member of the congregation or, what their backgrounds are. So they just wanted to get some idea. Who identified.
Who identified as a Jew.
Yeah.
It could be both, ethnic or...
Could you be louder?
It could be both then. It just asks if you identify as a Jew, which could be ethnic or it could be religious or...
Yeah, I knew someone growing up, and the mom was Christian, the father was, the other one was Jewish, and she never wanted to choose one or the other because she felt she was choosing a parent. So I can imagine her facing that question would have been extremely hard to answer if she couldn't say part.
So, in looking at the 20th century, the big issues, demographics, are not our friend. Jewish values are important to even the 20-something, but we have to communicate them in a different way. The key issues are relevance, identity, and whether or not the institutions that our forebears created are worthy of saving. Those are the issues of the 21st century. And I think the demographic challenge is problematic. Because as a population, as an ethnic group, we do not replicate ourselves. So in order for the Jewish community to grow, the Jewish couple has to have 2.3 children. Jews generally have less than that. Now, across the board, that's taking into account the Orthodox community is having 10 kids versus a much larger non-Orthodox community that are having 1 or 2. So we're not replicating. So in order to grow, you have to have at least 3 children, right? In order to maintain, you have to average out 2.3, I think it is. And the reality is we're not there and we're shrinking. We're also an aging, so that makes us an aging population. And as an aging population, we know where that leads. So there have been calls as of late to up the ante on conversion. Let's become a more proselytizing faith again. Let's bump up our outreach efforts. Let's open our tent. That's the big buzzword now. How do you as a community create a much more open tent? Which means, how do you bring in people who are sitting on the fringe, who are identifying culturally Jewish but I don't go to synagogue, or gastronomically Jewish but I don't want to learn, or educationally Jewish but don't bother me with an institution. So how do you create a much more open tent to bring people into the community who are marginalized by choice in some cases, by design and others, from the community institutions that we currently maintain.
And in the last 30 years or so, reform has become more with ritual. There's more Hebrew in the services than there used to be. People wearing yarmulkes, people wearing sandals. And in fact, aren't these two directions opposite of each other? Do people feel that by becoming more with additional ritual, you're going to bring people in? Is that one of the driving reasons for that direction?
I believe that's an organic process. Reform Judaism swung the pendulum so far to one extreme in the 40s and 50s that it was only natural that it swing just as far the other direction. There will come, the pendulum has not rested yet. There will come a place where it will rest. But the adoption of, honestly, the reason why Reform Judaism has embraced more traditional beliefs or traditional practices has more to do with the question, who's in the congregation today? So most Reform congregations are populated by people whose backgrounds are Orthodox or conservative, and now they're coming to a Reform congregation because it's more embracing, and they didn't leave behind the trappings of Orthodoxy or conservative Judaism. They've brought them with them. And so they're finding a home here. That doesn't mean a Reform congregation that you have to have those rituals. That's why we put a basket of kippot and we have taluses on a rack. And if you want to wear it, and if you don't want to wear it, don't wear it. Whereas if you went to a conservative congregation, you have to wear it. It's the custom. So it's what you create as the tent. It's why the discussion in Reform congregations today is about what are the boundaries for non-Jewish engagement in ritual life.
That got me confused there.
What role does a non-Jew play in the congregation?
Or can they play?
Can they play?
Like, what would the ritual committee say is appropriate?
So that conversation is happening all over the country. And Reform congregations are opening the tent up. There are things that are allowed here that would never be allowed in other congregations. All right? Because this is a more open tent. So here, a non-Jew can be called to the Torah. Now, we don't like to do it. We may find a lot of reasons why we shouldn't do it. But ultimately, if someone says, I want to do that, we allow that to happen here. In all the other Reform congregations I've served, that would never happen. Non-Jews couldn't be called to the Torah. But congregations all across the country are kind of unpacking that issue and saying, what are the real issues? What are the real boundaries? Can a non-Jew hold the Torah? Can they be on the bima? Can they do, what can they do?
Or can they stand next to somebody?
Yeah. And so we have this idea that the 21st century has to be a kind of a new engagement of It has to be an opportunity to experiment with a more open tent. Because we're not going to replicate ourselves by birth rate alone. And if we don't open the door, then we will, in essence, be closing the window.
Yes, but that begs the question, if we open the door, what are we left with?
Right.
There are some things that go on in this temple that, personally disturb me a lot about that. I'm not going to say what they are. But the question is, what are you left with? Are you really Jewish anymore? After a few more years?
Listen, I understand. There's a huge challenge in trying to identify what's the line. And what we've found is that most of these decisions are in the liminal.
Say that again.
Most of these decisions are in the liminal. The liminal is the space between two lines. It's no man's land. And what we're trying to do is traverse no man's land with Jewish value. And it's a hard process. And congregations will succeed or fail because of the way they traverse no man's land. And while it would be easy for us to put up boundaries and walls and borders and policies and create structure that's purely Jewish, ultimately that would lead us down a path of fewer and fewer people to engage. And so the 21st century has to have a different answer.
My background is reform. My father's and my mother too. We made the statement that the Reformed temple or ours in general are populated by converts or conservative or Orthodox families looking for a more open environment. Where did all the Reformed Jews go?
That's a great question. And so
maybe it's one big problem too.
right. So there are Reformed Jews who have gone to a more traditional path. As the movement changed and embraced more tradition, they embraced more tradition. There are also those who drift into disaffiliation. So while the population study may suggest that there are 5.2 million Jews in the United States, the reality might be closer to that 8 million number. And there's probably 3 million that have disaffiliated. And by disaffiliation, that's someone who is not a member of a synagogue, not known on a federation database, not a Jewish traditional name that someone can find in a directory, that they are completely disconnected from all the organized infrastructure of Jewish life. Why? They've chosen to be. It's not that they're forced to be that way. They've made a conscious decision because the organized structures of Jewish life have not done a great job in the 20th century of creating relevance. For a while we did. During the Civil Rights era, Reformed synagogues created a lot of relevance. It was the Reformed synagogues that were, pounding the beat of civil rights.
And supplying some of the marching.
Right. The leaders of many of the civil rights organizations were Reformed Jews, Reformed rabbis. These were people who created that relevance. But once the civil rights era was over, Reformed Judaism woke up and said, "Who are we?" We didn't have an answer. We began to create relevance in learning, education, in experimentation with ritual.
And a connection to Israel. Was a youth movement in the visits, I think.
Right. Although, the jury's still out on that.
Right.
Birthright has not had the post-trip engagement bump that everybody hoped it would be.
Well, also.
20-somethings don't join synagogues.
Well, yeah, but in camps and things like that, so that's what appeals to.
That's what my understanding was that camp,
Camp.
as an institution, has been one of the more successful in the sense of instilling a sense of Judaism in the 21st century and a younger crowd.
Right. But here's the rub. While it is very successful in doing that, it is becoming financially impossible for most families of Reformed congregations to send their kids to Jewish camp. Right? So the cost of a session at camp is approaching $5,000 a month.
So that's a month.
Right. For 3.5 weeks or something like that. It's close, and it's pricing itself out of the market. Yes, some families in this market, in this area, will spend $15,000 to send their kids to some frou-frou camp in the mountains in Vermont or something like that. But that's this market. Along the south, in the southwest, where, outside of the northeast, it's becoming increasingly difficult for camps to fill their spaces because of the cost of that. So Birthright came along and said, we'll send kids to Israel for free. And that's great. And they're sending lots of kids. But those kids aren't joining temples until they're in their 40s. They're not joining synagogues until they have kids of religious school age, that they need education for their kids. Now, that's great. It's not a bad thing. But think about the 15 years we're losing. They're engaged.
Historically, has that ratio changed of people joining when they have kids of age for, third grade, second grade? I mean, has that changed from the 60s to now? What percentage of people are joining? And then maybe staying members after?
Well, I think fewer people are joining. That's why congregations as a whole are declining.
But is it also possible, I've got several cousins who don't have any children at all, some never married. So is it just a reflection, perhaps, that you have a lot more maybe unmarried folks around, and that it's not so much that people were joining when they were 20, being part of a synagogue, that you're more likely they would have a family at a younger age, and therefore everything rolls quicker.
Well, let me frame it a little differently. In the first half of the 20th century, congregations flourished because there were no other outlets for Jews to join. couldn't join the country clubs, you couldn't join the community centers. You had your synagogue. And you were, affiliation rates were very high because that was your cultural community element. Even into the first half of the latter half of the 20th century, people were joining congregations because they felt a sense of obligation and responsibility, whether they were single or married or whatever. It's the latter half of the 20th century where we see the decline, where no longer are people joining congregations because they have a sense of responsibility, and definitely not in the 21st century. We've lost that sense of responsibility, that we have a responsibility to the next generation to ensure there's a synagogue here. Now people feel that it's about me. If I don't get relevance from this institution, I'm not joining.
Or is it really dealing with the previous generation? Through the 70s, the Holocaust had to be very prevalent in everyone's real life experience. And with joining, was that more of a reaction to the previous 20, 25 years? That for a future generation, maybe looking back saying, certainly the 1960s, that wasn't happening then, but let's be strong.
Common enemy. I have a question, something that's really been puzzling me. I had my Jewish education in the 1950s, and it was dreadful. It was terrible. All I learned to do was daven. That was about it.
Conservatives say that, right?
That's all we did. And I never really understood much about how relevant Judaism was to anything. So now education is fantastic. It's so much better. You'd think that people that would engender a much greater commitment to being Jewish. And yet you're saying it somehow isn't working. Is the education system still at fault in some way? Or is there something else going on?
Well, I think there's something else going on. I think what's going on is that as a society, we have a much more open society. So when has Judaism been strongly united? It's only been when there's an outside enemy.
We had an oppressor.
We had an oppressor. So now there's no oppressor. So what's the oppressor? The oppressor, so Stephen Cohen, who is the kind of the guru of Jewish demographers, suggests that the real enemy of Judaism in the 21st century is assimilation. It's not the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's assimilation. And that if we viewed the world as, if we viewed assimilation as an enemy, then we would have something to unite behind. But too many of our families don't view assimilation as the enemy. They view assimilation as success. That they can be engaged in a whole myriad of activities in their communities without question. And many will, choose, not many, some will choose that activity over the High Holy Days. There's a sporting event on Yom Kippur. Of course their kid has to go to the sporting event. That's a choice that people make. You know, it's not, that's the greatest challenge that we have. We can create all the glitzy, glamorous, fancy, whatever educational opportunities. When push comes to shove, the question that's asked is, you know, is what about relevance? And you know, is this going to advance me in life?
The institutions also need to be nimble and, you know, be able to respond to the community. Norwalk had a Jewish center that failed, a social Jewish center. Stanford, you know, thrived. And you know, it's the ability to adapt and meet the needs of, you know, the community. I think it's the goal for the synagogues.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why the one failed and one succeeded? I think it was the one that succeeded, at least the one at Stanford, moved out of the downtown location into a more suburban location, and, you know, was sort of head-to-head with the top-notch health clubs, and, you know, provided a social and recreational experience that was, you know, more modern, whereas the one in Norwalk, which was on the beach, was very nice.
Great
It
pool.
was very nice.
It's very nice.
You know, and I think just didn't,
Yeah.
you know, things changed, and it was there, but it was more, I think it was more like the Cabana Club.
Absolutely, yes.
And, you know, Cabana
So-
clubs
yeah.
sort of came and went.
Right.
And that one came and went. I think that, you know, so I think that's the goal, not only for the social institutions, but the, you know, those were Jewish, they weren't